So we're going to go over urine formation, and let's start with just a really quick brief overview of the nephron itself. We have our renal corpuscle with the glomerulus inside this ball of capillaries, surrounded by the glomerular capsule. Into the renal corpuscle, which will lead to the glomerulus, we have our afferent arteriole. Exiting it, we have the efferent arteriole. This will come out and make the peritubular capillaries, this capillary bed that overlays the tubules. Speaking of which, we have off of the renal corpuscle, we have our tubules with our PCT descending them of the nephron loop, and then our ascending them, finishing up with the DCT that will then go into the collecting duct. Now the peritubular capillaries actually lay over the tubules, but for clarity's sake, I've written them up there. So how do we form urine? This is a multi-step process, and it begins with the glomerulus. What happens is the afferent arteriole comes into the glomerulus. We have a dramatic decrease in size. And when we decrease size, we increase pressure. This pressure drives particles out of the blood plasma and into the capsule. This is called filtration, and the fluid that is formed is called filtrate. Now, pretty much everything gets filtered out. There are very few exceptions. Cells don't get filtered out, really large particles. Those are just some examples of things that don't get filtered. So we're filtering as much as we possibly can here. That filtrate then moves into the tubules. So after filtration, our filtrate moves to the tubules, and then we start two processes. So we have reabsorption and secretion. So with tubular reabsorption, what this is taking all those essentials and putting it back into the blood. So moving from the tubes into these peritubular capillaries. Or also they can be the vasa recta in our juxtamedullary nephrons. We're going to stick with peritubular capillaries for simplicity's sake right now. So moving particles from the tubes into the capillaries. Things like sodium and water and glucose, those essential things that we need. This is what's going to regulate and say, oh yes, we need more water, we need more sodium. This action is actually set up and facilitated by the movement of sodium. Depending on how much sodium is reabsorbed, that's going to set up the concentration gradients for everything else. So chlorine's going to follow, water's going to follow, glucose is going to piggyback its way in. So the movement of sodium is really key here to get everything else to move. So depending on how much sodium you reabsorb, that will determine how much water is reabsorbed, and chlorine that will follow as well. So sodium is key here. So we're moving, reabsorbing back into the blood. The second thing that's going to happen is tubular secretion. This is taking things that are still in the blood and putting them into the tubules, so going from capillaries to tubules. So these can be things that were too big to make it through the filtration process. So some hormones, some toxins, things that didn't make the filtration process but need to get out of your body. This is when they can be put into our tubules here. Now, while it's in the tubules, it's still considered filtrate. So we have filtrate from the glomerulus, it's still considered filtrate here in the tubules. It isn't considered urine until it gets to the collecting duct. Once it enters the collecting duct, that's when we call it urine. That's when our filtrate will be concentrated even more. The collecting duct can also reabsorb some water if we're still very dehydrated, so we can pull some more water out. So, I had an analogy given to me once, and I think it made a lot of sense, and I like to use it. Think of this as emptying out your junk drawer. You pull out the drawer, and the first step is to dump everything out. That's filtration. The next step is to start sorting through the process of what do you need to put back in the drawer and keep versus what do you need to eliminate and get rid of. So you're sitting and sorting, and that is going to be our reabsorption process, that portion of putting back in the blood. And then we also have our secretion process where it's like, oh wait, we still found something here that, no, this needs to get rid of. We don't need this, we don't need this. Get it into the filtrate so it can be then eliminated as urine. So that's a very quick overview of your information and the nephron itself.